Because the question is, behind what? It is so easy to believe that you are behind in life. Behind in life. It's such a vague idea, and yet it can run a lot of our sense of urgency, and it can create a lot of shame in our life. In the 1960s and 70s, with the work of Bernice Newgerton, she identified this idea of the social clock, which is the timeline that a society kind of decides on or projects onto itself of what you should be doing at a certain age. Like when you start a career, when you create a family, when you buy the house, whatever. They were saying that I think shortly right before that, those decades, was the most rigid that ours, like the Western society, had around the social clock. So maybe like the 50s. And then come around like 70s, 80s, you had some loosening of this grip on the social clock, on timelines of what you should be doing when. And yet, it's now been 40 years or 50 years since then. We still have this sense that we are behind something or like lacking in some way. And I think too, there's other studies that showed that social media has a role to play in this, that you're being fed the highlight reel of people's lives and you get this sense like, oh, everybody's doing all these things, but I'm not. And then you come back to yourself and your own life, which is not the highlights reel. It's just the regular humdrum daily with some great things, right? And then some really devastating things. And you're like, what's going on in my life? And then on top of that, we have our current society, which is just a complete shit show around major things coming to light, around economies potentially collapsing, around like all this insane things happening, which like in a lot of ways is good because we're seeing what's actually occurring. We're becoming more aware. That's great. And on the other hand, old systems are like grasping extra hard to try to take control. And even in that, your life gets affected in a really very real way. If you can't afford food, you're not going to be thinking about buying a house. If your currency crumbles, what happens then? There's no retirement age at that point. There's like, we have no idea what happens next. And I think too, that sense of having like a strict sense of timelines and the social clock could only really be even adhered to if you had wanted to, if you had a stable timeline, right? Like if your society was stable enough to allow for multiple generations experiencing a similar timeline. But the reality is that's probably never been the case in any part of history. I mean, okay, maybe some of it. A historian can correct me. Maybe there's been like stable time periods where over multiple generations you have just a consistency of experience. But I think at least in this last century, we've seen so much explode, and maybe it has to do with technology and like how that speeds up change, that, you know, I don't think we've ever had a decade that was the same as the last, right? We have very like distinct decades of things, and you'll see it culturally and you'll see it in pop culture, but way more than that, you'll see it socially and how things change, and then how people's ideas of things change. But I remember I was in middle school, definitely by high school, but I think I was even in middle school when I started having this belief come up around, I'm behind. I'm not where I should be. I need to be farther along. Ooh. Almost spilled my water. I need to be farther along. I'm not doing enough. I'm not being enough. I'm not enough. And that, I think, is largely what this feeling of being behind is about, is ultimately a belief that we've taken on and internalized around not being enough. Because how would you know that you're enough unless you could see yourself on that timeline, right? If you weren't validating that yourself. But so much of our world and our society and everything really pushes this idea of being outwardly validated, right? And even the sense that so like society and cultures and things, like your survival has historically, evolutionarily, and so forth, and even to this day, to some extent, hinges upon being in or out, right? Like, are you in and in community, or are you not? And so there is this sort of built-in sense too around seeking validation outwardly, because you want to be connected to community and you want to have that as part of your ability to survive. There's also this invitation, as we've evolved even as a society and as people and everything, that we can find that validation within ourselves. I think we should always start there. But that's something that can take a while to really internalize because of so much of that messaging around outward validation. And then my mind is also thinking about like the beauty industry, because I've looked at this a little bit, but not too deeply around, especially around my generation, being like I think I'm an elder millennial. I don't know where the line is, that there was so much media around bodies and objectification of the female body and having a very strict like sense of what you need to look like and what was beautiful and what wasn't. And then on top of that, like all the products like being pushed around beauty and things. And that just in general, women get this internalized message that, you know, my value is validated by other people agreeing that I'm beautiful, because it's only in this sort of outward expression of that. But like apart from that, right, I'm talking about timelines, which that does also play a role, because on timelines, on your timeline of your life, you go through the aging process. And if part of your life and your values associate with beauty, it can be really hard to live the reality of a timeline and a life where you get older. It seems that more and more people now are really reclaiming their own ability to self-determine their life. And I know we've talked about this when we were talking about relationship anarchy. Go check those out. I swear I'll get back to the book club. I just found that I hit a sort of burnout mentally just with things in life. And so I couldn't focus because the book is very dense and I just couldn't like keep going. But I will get back to it. Next week I go to a new pet sit where I change locations in some way. And so I'll have more capacity after this transition. I'll get back to that. Okay, what we're talking about. Blah, blah, blah. Self-determination. Right. But to be self-determined, you have to be self-validated, right? Because there's going to be a part of you that wants to know that what you're doing is okay. You know, like we don't usually just choose something without a care of whether this matters to us or like, you know, what happens, right? So there's that sense of being self-determined really requires that sense of self-validation. So with that, you have to address, and it gives you this beautiful opportunity to address where we have that belief about being behind. And I know I didn't go too deeply into the idea of midlife renaissance. I just kind of like posed the idea, and I said I liked it, that phrase over midlife crisis, because it's like a whole other way of approaching it. But this is a part of it too. So maybe you didn't start believing you were behind in middle school like I did. Maybe you're beginning to come to this idea now in midlife, if you're in midlife. Especially as things become inaccessible, like that timeline, the social clock timeline of what you should, quote unquote, have been able to do or be or have by a certain age, as those things become more and more inaccessible to more and more people, you start feeling the sense of like disconnection to the time, like to what it means to be a person, because of being handed that timeline and then kind of having it fall out from under you. Then what? There's a certain sort of unsecure, what's the term? You sort of floating sense of like, how do I define myself? You know, how do I view myself? And what's really powerful, because I've thought about this a lot, because I've done a lot of sort of like questioning my own identity, and my identity has changed a lot over many, many times in my life. So for me, I'm like, yeah, like I love this idea of being able to define myself or be just the question. You know, like I'm willing to do that. That's to me is exciting, but that's very uncomfortable for most people to lose a sense of identity, especially when it's associated with a timeline and a culture and a community and where you fit. You know, like what happens now? I feel disconnected from things. And so one thing that That is interesting, because I was really having a hard time just like understanding the concept of death when my mom died suddenly, almost 2 years ago. And I just like, I think like as an autistic person and whatnot, the transition was so sudden and just kind of like fried me in a way. And I was like, I don't understand that someone could just not be here. And what's interesting is like I've experienced that with my grandparents and great uncles and things, right? Like I've experienced death, but it was like so close and such a leap from, I guess, people I experienced as being older, and there was sort of a transition into like they're aging now, and then it was just like bam. And so I was like kind of struggling with even the concept of like, what, how can this be so permanent and like a thing that just happened? And my brother really helped me because he said the way he was able to sort of conceptualize what was happening, because both of us are kind of like conceptual people first. I gotta understand. He's like, I view the sense of life and death through like a much larger evolutionary like continuum, right? That there were generations of people before and they died, and that this is like the elements that helped create the next one. And then it's like this, for some reason, just the zooming out, outside of just my life and her life and like this thing that happened right now or at that time, it helped me to just sort of put at ease again this sense around like what the hell is happening, and understanding and getting a sense of how I could sort of make peace in myself about a change. Because this too, around identity and culture and things, the reason why I think we have this sense of being behind now is because so much has changed. And when that happens, you can lose sense of where you are in position to reality, in a sense. I mean, not to like completely depersonalize ourselves, but like you lose a sense of like solidness. And you can either relax into that feeling that can be very uncomfortable to be with, or you can also do this practice of zooming out and being like, okay, yeah, like I am one part of all the things happening on this planet and all the things that have come before and will be after me. And then this fixation on these like little things that we've decided must happen at certain ages is just an idea. Like so many things in our life, it's just an idea. Like the idea of gender, like the idea of what you have to be. And like, I don't know, there's so many things, right? It's just an idea. And when I begin to relax around that sense of, or when I begin to understand like where the timeline came from, that it is an element of social control, not necessarily in a bad way, but just in a, this is how we understand things, and then, move forward. I feel like for me at least, it brings a sense of reclaiming your own power. Like, okay, like I get it. Sure, society has an idea of what you should be doing. That's what society does. It creates these norms and things, and it fits people into boxes because it's this overarching idea, and that's the simplicity is all it can really handle. But you are complex. You are beautiful and unique. And at the level of society where you sit as an individual, you get to decide how much of that you care about, if any, and what then you actually do care about. You get to decide for yourself what this life looks like. And I think that's so beautiful and so powerful. So, ultimately, you're not behind. There is no behind. That's just an idea that came from another idea that was all made up on this weird little rock that we float upon in this vast universe of space, right? You're not behind. And that means you can pull all of that energy from every place and every time frame and every moment you decided you were behind and bring it all back to this present now and decide, cool, all right, so what do I really want? What then happens next that I get to choose? What do I want to happen next? What's my next step? What would I like? Right? So that's how I've made peace with it. Those are some of my thoughts today about that and life, and this being part of my own midlife renaissance. Or renaissance. I like Renaissance. Okay, I'll see you back here again tomorrow with another video. My name is Lux. We explore things like being self-determined, things like prioritizing our pleasure, our empowerment, choosing and creating our own life, our sovereignty is a big thing, and more things that I will decide over time. So, yeah, tell me how this landed for you. Have you felt behind? Are you feeling behind? What has this perspective opened up, if anything? Or do you have other thoughts? I'm curious. Let me know, and I'll see you again very soon.